Good morning. This is Getting Started with Sourdough, the second of two workshops. I hope some of you joined us for the first one on making your own starter. If not, we'll give a little bit of a recap. But first of all, we're just going to wait a moment while hopefully a few people join us, and then we'll get started. So while we're actually waiting, what I might show you is a couple of loaves that I baked earlier in the week and that I froze, just to show you that you can actually bake a whole loaf, freeze it, and have it come out of the freezer 10 minutes in the oven, and it will be like fresh again. I'll just grab it. So this is one, as you can see, I've pre-sliced it. So if I open it up, you can see that you've got lots of lovely holes. This is just a plain white sourdough made with, fairly dramatic lighting in the kitchen this morning. Okay, so we'll get back to that in a sec, but first of all, a couple of bits of business. Okay. Welcome to Getting Started with Sourdough for Moreland Library. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people. So it makes me very emotional. As the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways in the area now known as Moreland, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as to all First Nations communities who significantly contribute to the life of the area. Sorry, it makes me very emotional. Okay. All right, so let's get started. So I hope a few of you have joined us again from a fortnight ago when we made starters. I hope that you now have an active starter like this. As you can see, mine was fed last night. This is where it was up to when I actually, like before I fed it, and now it's risen and started to drop again, so that it's actually ready to be incorporated into some dough. All right, so we're going to be doing that in a second. How the session is going to work, we're going to run through a little bit of a recap of the history of what sourdough is and why it's good for you. We're going to look at making dough from scratch, how you do it without kneading, because a lot of people worry about when they're making bread, they have to do a lot of kneading. I personally have arthritis in my hands. I don't like kneading, and I've found a lot of methods where you just don't need to knead at all, and I'm going to show you one of those. Then we're going to pop a couple of loaves in the oven. So I've actually got a couple of loaves. I'm going to tilt my camera down. I'm going to see if we can give a little bit more of a visual this time. You can see here. Okay, so pardon the dramatic lighting. I have two loaves in their banneton ready to go into the oven. So I'm just going to do things a little bit back to front. We're going to show you what they look like when they come out of the oven, but that means I need to get them in the oven at the start. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to mix a batch of dough and show you how to, over the course of an hour, make dough without any kneading. We're going to look at tools and equipment. We're going to look at a little bit of history. I'm sorry guys, I don't know what's going on. I have lost video. So if anybody can hear me, I apologise. I'll see if I can work out what's going on. It's still working for me. Okay. So I'm not sure if anybody can hear me. Sorry, just bear with me a little bit, guys. We're just going to see if we can make sure the technical side of this is actually working.
Oh, yep. Everyone can hear you, they say.
Oh, thank you. Okay, that's great. All right, well, I'm sorry. I might have to take your guidance then on what you can see and what you can't see, because I can't see myself at all in the screen, so I apologise for that. Pardon me. Thank you for the messages saying that you can still see it, though. All right, as with last time, my daughter Meg is helping, so if you have any questions, she'll be letting me know that you have questions, and then we'll be going from there. All right, so first things first, we're going to turn the existing loaves out of their banneton onto boards and get them in the oven. So I'm going to tilt the camera down. Please let me know, or in fact Meg will let me know if she can't see what's going on, but anybody else, if you have any issues, please let us know. All right, so is that... Okay, so we have a little bit of a delay. I apologise. Sort of the weird nature of the beast. All right, so I've got a wooden board that I use as a pizza peel. I hope you can see it. I'm going to tip my dough out of the banneton onto the board, and then I'm going to slash the top of the loaf to actually let the air vent from it, so that I can control the way that it rises. So the trick with this, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work, is to tip it out really quickly. So I have to flip it and then take the banneton off. As you can see, sometimes it starts to stick. I'm just going to... All right. Now, when you put a loaf in the oven, you need to, as I said, you need to slash the top of it to control the rise, because otherwise it will break unevenly. You won't have any control over where it actually breaks and how even the loaf looks. It's called a baker's signature. Actually, bear with me a sec. We're just going to try and get the video happening again.
Did you just get off that page? What does it say?
No, it's... I apologise.
Just keep going.
Okay, we're going to keep going. Meg's adjusting the light because obviously that's blinding a few people. I apologise. Okay, so baker's signature. Apart from allowing the air to escape in a controlled way and the steam to escape in a controlled way, it was a way of identifying loaves when they were baked in communal ovens. So many bakers have their own very special signature that they use. I tend to do, on a round loaf, I tend to slash across all four sides of the top. Now, if you go in at an angle, what you're going to get is a thin cut at the edge and a thicker cut at deeper down, and it allows these things called ears to develop, which is on this loaf that I showed you before. Again, I apologise because I can't see what's going on. I don't know if you can see the raised up little edge. That's called an ear. Okay, so I'm going to go all the way around this loaf and just make a few cuts. This is called a grignette. It's a razor blade on a handle. You can use just a regular razor blade, which I'll show you in a sec on the next loaf. Okay, so that one's ready to go. I'm going to pop this into the oven first, and then I will come back and do the second loaf. Okay, one thing I need to do is about a bit more than a cup of water and a spray bottle to spray in the oven for steam. Okay, the steam helps the crust develop and gives it a really, it adds to the rise as well. Okay, so here's my second board. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to tip it out quickly. I made an error with the last one because it actually wasn't quite on the baking paper, so it stuck to the board as I tried to move it out, which is why you might have heard me cursing as I was putting things in the oven. Okay. Now, one of the things that can happen with these banneton, you can see I didn't tip this out quickly enough. I hope you can see. And the dough has just sort of stuck a little bit. Now, don't ever worry, just very gently tease it off. There we go. You can see it's got a little bit of a pleat in the top, but that's fine, it will work perfectly. Okay, so this time I'm just going to use an ordinary razor blade, which I have in a little protective case. Just a regular safety razor, and I'm just going to slash from top to bottom. If you're slashing, and remember to go in at an angle, if you're slashing a loaf from end to end, make sure you get all the way to the end. Otherwise, it cannot, it might actually not sort of release the cut properly, and you might still have odd protrusions. Not that it makes any difference because the dough still cooks and works as well as it should. Bear with me, I'm just going to pop this in the oven. so I've set a timer for 20 minutes for that. Thank you. Now, what I want to show you next is how to actually... sorry, my computer is being very odd today. I really apologise. I'm going to show you how to mix a batch of dough, and we're going to talk about what sourdough is and why it's good for you. Okay, so I won't be a second. All right, so I tend to mix my dough in containers like this. You can use, and I often do use, 2 bowls. And if I'm using the bowls, I will have one inverted. So I'll start off with dry ingredients in one, wet ingredients in the other, and then the one with the dry ingredients I will invert over the dough to make like a humid little cloche for it, and that will keep it moist and rising as it's supposed to, because humidity is really important in terms of getting the dough to rise properly. I tend to use containers like this because I will sometimes have 2 or 3 batches on the go. I might want to put them in the fridge to retard the rise, and this is a really good way of doing it because they stack. So as you can see here, I'm going to show you how to mix it, but this is one that I made earlier, which will let us develop the dough, and I can show you how to shape it.
You've just got a couple of oven questions.
Oh, sorry, I have oven questions, yeah?
What temperature are you baking at?
Okay, so I've given you notes, which I will, hopefully you can download. Pardon me, but I have the oven preheating for an hour with a pizza stone in it, so that it is really hot and it's at top temperature. So I usually have it at about 240 to 250, and then I will usually, after I've put the steam and put the loaves in, I'll usually bake for 15 to 20 minutes at that temperature, and then I'll reduce it down to about 220. So that information should be in your notes. If it's not, I apologise, and I can amend those and upload new ones.
And the other one is, what are you putting the loaves on when they go in the oven?
Oh, okay. Let me grab a pizza stone and show you. Alright, so I'm using a board with baking paper as a pizza peel to slide it into the oven, so that way. And when it goes into the oven, it's on one of these. So I have a spare because I broke one of mine. Don't ever put a pizza stone into a hot oven because it will just crack. Always heat your oven with the pizza stone in it from cold, but then it takes a long time to actually heat up. So as I said, I preheat for an hour, then bake, and it goes directly onto the pizza stone. Now, a lot of people use Dutch ovens. You can also use glass casseroles with, you know, the old, like the Pyrex casserole with a glass lid. If you bake like that, you don't need to add steam to your oven because they create and will provide the steamy environment themselves. I don't like baking like that, mainly because I find the Dutch oven's way too heavy to lift in and out of the oven. That's just a personal thing, and I find the pizza stone works really well. You can always do a combination. You can do a pizza stone with an overturned saucepan to keep the steam in, and that forms a Dutch oven, as long as you don't have Bakelite handles and you're going to melt them in the oven. It's got to have stainless steel handles. And that, if you're going to do that, that needs to be preheated as well. Also, if you're going to do that, you need to act really quickly so it stays hot. But there are millions and millions of tutorials online about how to bake in a Dutch oven. If you're interested in doing that way, I really highly recommend going and looking. I think Patrick Ryan at Firehouse Bakery in Ireland has a tutorial. I think Jack of Bake with Jack has a tutorial on baking with a Dutch oven. Just literally, if you Google sourdough bread made in a Dutch oven, you'll find so many tutorials you won't know what to do. But for me, I find a pizza stone works really well. Okay, so we're going to make a batch of dough. I'm going to tilt the computer down and we'll get going so you can actually see how you do it. The first thing I want to tell you though is you need to, when you do this, your dough is going to look like a horrible mess when you start. Don't worry. What you do is you mix it and you let it sit for between 30 minutes and 30 minutes and an hour, and it goes through a process called autolysis. Now, when the dough is autolyzing, it starts to align all of the gluten strands in the dough for you, and it basically does half the work, which is why you don't have to do much kneading. All right, so let's tilt this down and let's have a look at how we do it. Okay, thank you very much. All right, so I have digital kitchen scale, container on top. I do everything by weight because I just think it's more accurate. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is put in my starter, and I'm doing what you have in your recipe, which is 100 grams of starter, 500 grams of flour, 10 grams of salt, and I've gone completely blank, 350 grams of water. Okay, so I'm going to tip the starter in first, and you can see it's really foamy, or I hope you can see that it's really foamy. So I'm just going to weigh 100 grams of starter. Then I'm going to put the water in, and I'm going to do the 350 grams of water. So my scales need to come up to 450. Okay, so it's much easier to do if you mix your starter through your water, with your water right at the start. Okay, so up to 450. Now, I have a number of tools that are really good for mixing. Just a kitchen whisk is really good. This is called a kneading whisk, which is particularly good for, like, it's made for making bread. I know not everybody will have one of these. This is just one of my finds. So I'll use a regular whisk, and I'm just going to, sorry, I might take it off the scales. Whisk the starter and the water together. Is that visible? Yep. All right. So that's just largely mixed through. There's no clumps of starter left. You still see a little bit of it there. All right, so now I'm going to zero my scales again. And I'm going to add 350 grams, 500 grams of flour. And in this case, I'm actually using plain flour from Coles because I actually ran out in making loaves for the class. I ran out of my flour that I normally use, which is a bulk one. So I'm just weighing this out. So I'm up to 320. So, okay. All right, so that's 500 grams. Now, the only requirement you need with your flour is that it has a reasonable protein content. Can you please pass me the salt? Yep, thank you. Thank you. Now, plain flour in Australia has 10 grams of flour, 10 grams of protein. That is more than adequate for bread making. Anything below 10 starts to get a little bit soft and doesn't hold its structure as well. So I think we're pretty right. If you can't get any fancy flours, if you don't want to try sort of proper bread making flours, you can actually just use regular plain flour from one of the supermarkets. All right, so I'm just going to add 10 grams of salt. Okay, so this is just pink Himalayan salt because that's what I have on my kitchen bench. Okay, so now I'm up to 10. All right, so I'm going to take them off the scales, and I'm just going to mix this with the whisk. Now, what you find is it's, it starts mixing really easily, and then sort of clogs up your whisk, and you need to mess around with it. One thing I will say while I think of it is don't ever be tempted not to put the salt in, because it's one of those things that bread without salt is just completely unpalatable. All right, so I have a number of tools here. These are all different pastry blades and mixers. They range from, $4 at a kitchen shop to 50 cents, pardon me, at a $2 shop. I actually really like this one. So all I'm going to do now is just scrape this out.
And was that the one from the $2 shop?
This is actually, is it from a $2 shop? I think this one was a kitchen shop one, but it was just one of those bargain bin ones, and it literally was 50 cents. And I went recently and checked, because there are a couple of other tools I'm going to show you in a minute. I'm going to have to get my hands in here. That have, that you can get at $2 shops, which are so useful and literally will only cost you a couple of dollars. So as you can see, if you use a whisk, this gets a bit messy, but we'll just pop it out. Now, I've said in your notes, and I think it's really worth mentioning, that if you're making one loaf, it's just as easy to make two. The recipes double really well, as I've said. Sorry, as you can see, I'm about to mess myself. The recipes double super easily, and you can freeze an unsliced loaf without any trouble and then refresh it. It will literally be, after 10 minutes back in the oven with a bit of steam, it will be literally like a fresh loaf. So you can save yourself, because it's such a long process, you can actually save yourself the drama of having to do it sort of 2 or 3 times a week. You can, or sort of maybe 4 times a week, you can do it twice a week and just have bread in the freezer. It's also nice if you've got people coming around and you can grab a loaf and it looks like you've prepared, you know, hours in advance for them coming, but really you just had it there.
So you can just do it on the weekend.
Yeah, so you make it on the weekend. All right, so, and that is really important. If you're only going to bake once a week and your starter's going to be in the fridge for a week, then you can take it out on, say, Thursday night, feed it. Friday night, you're ready to make your dough. Saturday, you're going to be ready to bake. Okay. All right, so this is, as you can see, a really gloppy, horrible mess. But don't worry, that's as much kneading as you need to do now or the next one. So I'm just going to pop this to one side. Find where I put its lid.
It's just under there.
Oh, thank you. All right. So, can everybody still see me okay? Meg, can you see me okay?
Yeah, do you want to tilt back up to your
Thank
face?
you. All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to do is look at what the dough looks like when it's had its hour of autolysis, or it's half an hour. We're going to crash the program on this one because of the time frame, and we're going to only let it autolyse for maybe 20 minutes, and then I'll show you how it develops, because it will still work. Anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour of autolysis makes a big difference. So I'll be able to show you how it develops even in a shorter time. Excuse me, I'm just going to pop this over here. Sorry, as you can imagine, in my house I end up covered in flour and dough, and I spend my life brushing flour off my shirts. All right, so the dough's been sitting for an hour. In fact, I'm just going to backtrack a little bit. This is a batch of dough that I made last night. Okay. Now, pardon me. As you can see, I'll show you the difference in the doughs. Okay, so this is a double batch, but as you can see, or I hope you can see, the texture of the dough is very, very different. This is shiny and glossy. This has, it's risen a lot. If I didn't want to bake with it now, it will continue to rise. Pardon me, and often I'll leave it for 24 hours, and by the time I'm ready to bake, it will be close to the top of the container. Obviously, this one's not going to do quite that much because it's half the quantity, but if you leave it a full 24 hours and it is filling the container, the loaf basically takes the same amount of time to make, because the difference becomes how long. This is what is called the bulk rise, and the difference that is introduced is if you let it do a longer bulk rise, you can do a shorter final rise in the banneton. If you haven't let it develop fully in the bulk rise stage, you can pick that up and let it prove for longer in the final proving stage when it's in its shaped form. If you don't have banneton, which I didn't have until very recently, you can use a bread tin. You can shape your loaf by hand and put it onto just a baking tray. If you do that, I would suggest, because sourdough tends to pancake unless it has some sort of structure to hold it together while it's rising, you can put baking paper underneath it, support it at the side with rolling pins so that it holds its shape while it's actually developing. I recommend grabbing like a regular bread tin or a cake tin, get an old tea towel or a piece of calico or something, flouring it very heavily and putting that underneath your bread and shaping it in that sort of shaped environment so that it holds its structure, and then when you turn it out it has much more chance of not completely pancaking.
So someone's just asked what the word is, banneton.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so let me grab them. Okay, so banneton is, I think it's a French word for basket. So they're cane baskets. These ones have like cloth linings. So they're just a cane basket. As I said, I've literally only had these for maybe 12 months. I don't know if you can see that it's got quite a heavy coating of flour on it. The trick with these is to not wash them in between proving, because the skin develops on the cloth, which then makes it easier for the dough to release when you're trying to turn it out, which is, as I was saying, you have to turn it out quickly still or it can stick, but it and the skin helps with that. So they're banneton, but honestly I would and have used for many years, bear with me, of course it's hiding from me now. I just have a bread loaf tin that I line with a piece of cloth or a piece of baking paper. And again, if you bake in a Dutch oven, you can actually use, or one of the casseroles, you can actually use the casserole to actually shape the loaf as well as baking it in afterwards. So, I apologise. Okay, so this is the dough we've just made. This is the dough that I made last night.
Maybe hold it right up to the camera.
Sorry. Okay. All right. So how's that going?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, because of the delay, I'm not quite sure. So this is the dough that we've just made, and this is the dough that I made last night. And I don't know if you can see, there are lots of bubbles in it, so you can see that it's rising. So I want to show you how to shape those, because shaping them is really important to how the loaf will stay together. Alright, so we haven't actually talked again about why sourdough is good for you, and I think it's really important to know it's not just a fad that has come up during isolation. So, for a lot of people, that's been a really good opportunity for them to actually start baking. It's really good for you because it pre-digests some of the starches in the flour, and so it makes it lower GI. It's better for your gut flora. It has it produces minerals like magnesium, which are very good for you, and that makes it, apart from being a pleasurable activity to do, also very good to eat for you as well. Okay, so when you're shaping your loaves, I do it on an unfloured bench top. Okay, so I'm going to come up here again for a sec. You shape it on an unfloured bench top because you need a little bit of tension in your dough while you're shaping it. It's really interesting. Dough has, while it's rising, it has a sticky side and a dry side, and the aim is to get the sticky side on top so that it will stick to itself when you shape it. And I'll show you how this works. So I'm going to tilt the camera down again, and then I'm going to shape these loaves and put them into the baskets, which I'm going to heavily flour first so that they will release again when this is ready. So I'm just having trouble with my liner there. All right, so tilt this down again. Here we go.
Yeah, maybe even a little bit.
Oh, thank you. Okay. I really apologise that I can't actually see what I'm doing, but thank heavens you guys are keeping on top of it for me. Okay, what's going on there? Sorry, I've just had a window pop up on mine. Is that visible on yours?
No, what is this?
It's just like a chat window. Sorry, just bear with me a sec, guys. I'm just going to close this one down. There we go. All right. So I hope that's still visible. All right. So I don't know if you can see. I'm just pulling the dough out of the container, and you can see how stretchy it is. That's great. So all the gluten's aligning and doing what it's supposed to. Okay, so you can see there's a little bit, pardon me, a little bit left. Oh, excuse me, I have to attend to the oven. All right, so that's the 20-minute mark on the loaves that we put in the oven. So I'm just going to quickly set a timer for those again. All right, so we've got our dough here. This is one of the other tools that I was talking about. This is called a bench knife. Last time I checked, about $4 at one of the sort of everything stores, $2 shop, but yeah, about $4. It is one of the most useful tools both for cleaning up your bench and for working with your dough. So I'm just going to cut the dough in half, and I'm going to lift half of it and put it to one side. Now, this might seem really scary when you start, but your dough is really elastic, and what you want to do is stretch it out. And in fact, this is still really quite elastic because I haven't left it to rise quite as long as I normally would. It's got a lot more resistance. I don't know if you can see that it's sort of fighting me when I want to pull it out. So I want to incorporate those air bubbles that we saw in the other one. I hope you can see these air bubbles here. And the more folding you do, the more air you're going to incorporate. Okay, so, pardon me, I am going to fold the bottom half of this up over the top. I'm going to grab the top half. Now, this is where the bench knife really comes in handy. Sometimes your dough is really wet and it's hard to handle. You can actually do all of your shaping with your bench knife. Is that still visible? Okay, so this one is going to be a round loaf, and as you can see, it's really sticking to itself, but it's not sticking to the bench. Okay, so now what I want to do is form it into like a rough ball so that it will take the shape of the banneton that it's going into. So all I'm doing literally is pulling from underneath and stretching it across and sticking it to itself. And because that's the sticky side up, that works really well to hold itself together. And you'll see as you're going through that it starts to develop air bubbles as well. Now, up to you if you want to pop these. I generally don't unless they're massive, because I think it they tend to settle while it's rising. I might pop the odd one on the top when it's in its basket so that it doesn't, because when you flip the dough out it's upside down, so you don't have a big bubble on the bottom. Okay, so there's my shaped ball of dough. This one's going to go into the round basket. So this is another tool that is really, really useful. It's a flour dredge. I use this all the time. Just have it full of whatever flour I'm using. Always plain, not self-raising, in case, or just because I don't want to add any extra raising agents. So heavily floured the banneton. I'm going to flour what will become the bottom of the loaf. I want to flip it and put the seam side down so that as it continues to rise, it's going to sort of amalgamate itself into a solid loaf. So now I'm just going to lift it with the bench scraper and flip it into the basket. Okay, so let's reposition that a little bit. So it's got a nice shape. I'm going to put extra flour around the edge and over the top, and just sort of tuck it in so that it's a really nice even shape. Now, I'm going to leave that on the bench, and I would often shape this at night before I go to bed and leave it while I'm in bed to do its final rise, uncovered on the bench just at room temperature. Mainly because what it does is, with the little bit of flour on the top and with the time that goes into it, it forms a skin on the top, which again helps to maintain the integrity of the loaf when you flip it out onto your board to put it into the oven. So that development of a skin is really, really useful. The other thing that you can do if your dough is, if the timing doesn't work for you, you have it ready, but you're not actually ready to bake, sorry, I'm just trying to get my laptop to actually turn back on for me. You can actually put your dough in the fridge overnight. And there's information about this in the notes, and you can retard the rise, basically. So say it was 10 o'clock on any evening, and I decided that I really didn't want to stay up for the hour and a half that preheating the oven and baking the bread was going to take. I could then put that as it is into the fridge, uncovered, and then pull it out in the morning, heat my oven up, and in the time that the oven takes to heat up, the bread will have come back to room temperature and be ready to go in the oven, and then you can just bake it first thing in the morning when it suits you. So you can really work these things, and again, there are lots and lots of tutorials on different ways you can do it, different timings you can do that make it able to fit in with what you're wanting to do. Okay, so we've got the round one shaped. I'm going to shape the other one for the oval loaf. And then we're going to go back and look at our dough that we made at the start and see how that's changed and how we can actually see it all developing. Okay, so I'm going to tilt the camera down again. Okay, I hope that's in the right spot. Same thing again. There's a little bit of flour on the bench now because I floured the banish on, but that's just incidental, not specifically for this. So again, I'm going to stretch the loaf out, the dough out, and as you can see, it's super, super stretchy. This means that the gluten is really working, and you can, I don't know if I can show you. There's a piece here that's like really translucent. You can actually see shadows behind it. That is passing what we call the window pane test really well, and there are, again, notes about this for you. That shows that the gluten has developed sufficiently to actually be able to make bread out of it, which is good because we're making bread out of it. But if that wasn't working, if that was breaking instead of stretching like that, then I would consider doing a pre-shape and then letting it rise some more to let the gluten develop more. Okay, so I'm going to pull this again using the bench knife. And if you don't have one of these, that's not an issue at all. I just find it a super useful tool. You can always use your finger, get very messy as I do. Okay, so pardon me. So I'm going to make this more of an oval shaped loaf. So I'm going to stretch it out into a bit of a rectangle. And it's really resisting me, which is lovely because it means it's all the gluten's doing exactly what you want it to do. Alright, and then I'm just going to fold one end over to the middle, the other end over to the middle, and then I'm going to pull the ends up. Again, sticky side up so that it will hang on to itself. Now you can see I've sort of got a little bit of an odd shape, so I'm just sort of going to tease that out a little bit. Okay, but this shows you that it doesn't have to be perfect. It will, you know, like it can be rough and ready and still make absolutely beautiful bread by the time you finish. And this is the way I always make my bread, sometimes with cleaner hands. But okay, so I'm going to just quickly flour this banish on as well. Really, really important that you put lots of flour on it because if you don't, as I said, it just won't release. A little bit of flour on the bottom too, just to make sure, because that is particularly sticky. Pick it up with the bench knife, flip it upside down into the basket. Again, just releasing that little bit there. And then I'm going to put a bit of flour on the top. And I'm going to tuck that in. Oh, and I can actually smell I need to turn the oven down. So bear with me 2 seconds. I'm just going to do that. Now, I did turn the oven down when the timer went off before. But I think what I can actually smell is the baking paper getting over hot. So at the point where you turn the oven down, the loaves are set enough that you can actually take the baking paper out, and I generally do. And I would recommend that you do too, so that it doesn't get so hot that it burns in your oven. All right, so there we have a round loaf and an oval loaf ready to go. Again, 2 cake tins, 2 bread tins, whatever you have will work perfectly. Line with fabric or baking paper to stop them sticking, and you're good to go. All right, so I'm just going to pop those to one side.
Do you have time for a question?
I do have time for a question, thank you.
Would you grease and flour a metal loaf tin?
Would I grease and flour? Yes, oh, it's really interesting. If I was just if I was making a yeasted bread, I would definitely grease it. I don't necessarily flour them. Um, yeah, that's a really interesting question because it's honestly been so long since I've made a sourdough loaf in a tin without um, having a cloth or something in it. I think I would probably tend towards putting baking paper in it rather than. Sorry, I apologise. Rather than greasing and flouring, mainly because you can then use the baking paper to lift it out as well, which is really helpful. I don't know. I guess it depends on the tin, and I think maybe you try it and you see how you go.
And important to say, if you're shaping it with a cloth, you don't then put the cloth in the oven.
Oh, correct. Yes, thank you. Yes, you always tip it out and take it out of the basket, whatever you're proving it with, and leave the cloth behind. Yeah, quite right. Okay, so now I want to show you what this dough is doing. All right, so we'll tip this back down again. All right, so this has been autolyzing, pardon me, for half an hour or so. And I'm just going to get a bowl of water. One of the workshops we did last year at Brunswick Library, an in-person one, someone said to me to use a wet hand to mix the dough, and it actually works brilliantly. And you see, if you wet your hand beforehand, it doesn't actually stick to your hand in the same way. I hope you can see this. So all I'm doing is grabbing a piece of the dough and pulling it up over the ball of dough, and then I'm turning the container and grabbing it and stretching it over. Now this is very early in the piece, so as you can see, like, it's starting to become smoother. I hope you can see that it's starting to become smoother. I'll just scrape down the sides a little bit so it's clearer. Alright, so wet your hand in a bowl of water and then just literally grab the dough and pull it. And you can see it is starting to develop the gluten, but at this stage it will break. So not ready to do anything with yet. But this is literally all of the kneading you do. Okay, so I'm going to pop that to one side and just let that do its thing for another 10 minutes. So I'm just going to quickly set a timer for 10 minutes. Pardon me, I have a frog in my throat today. All right. Okay, so what's next? One of the questions that came up before today's class was about proportions of sourdough discard and how you can use those in regular recipes so that you don't waste them. Pardon me. Okay, so there was a set of notes that was included with the workshop held 2 weeks ago, and I would say please go and download those if you haven't seen them already. Basically, what you can do is any recipe that calls for yeast, if you have an active discarded starter, so one that's ready to use but you've just got too much of it, you can substitute, say, 200 grams of starter for 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water in your recipe. And if it is active, 1 cup of starter, which is about 200 grams, is the equivalent to a sachet of yeast, which is, again, about 7 grams of yeast, which is what most recipes will call for. So 1 cup of active starter, discard or otherwise, will replace a teaspoon of yeast in a yeasted recipe, a sachet of yeast in a yeasted recipe. You just have to make sure whatever you use it in, that you deduct the same amount of flour and water from your recipe as you are adding in starter. So 200 grams of starter equals 100 grams of water and 100 grams of flour. You can use it in pretty much anything. It doesn't have to be active. And I actually made, to show you, I made a pizza dough. Now, this pizza dough, I don't know if you can see all the bubbles and stuff in it, this was made with active starter, but it doesn't have to be. This one is, again, from Patrick Ryan of Firehouse Bakery. You add your starter, you kick it along with a little bit of commercial yeast as well, and mix olive oil, water, salt, and I can put a link to the recipe, or you guys can email me if you would like it. So water, salt, olive oil, flour, starter, tiny bit of yeast, and a bit of semolina. And you mix it the same way we mix the dough that we're working on, very roughly, and put it in the fridge and leave it for 24 hours. And it does all the work for you. It does, through autolysis, it actually aligns all the gluten strands, develops all the gluten in such a way that it will roll out beautifully. As you can see, it's got so much air, or I hope you can see, so much air in it. And again, this is only about halfway through. I guess it's rising, so by tonight it will be full. Excuse me for a second. Okay. I'm just going to grab the loaves out of the oven. So here's one. And I'll talk about those in just a sec. All right, so one thing that I want to talk about now, when you're slashing your loaves, sometimes it will fill the slashes as it expands, and sometimes you will get the ear that we talked about, depending on how you slash it and whether it's on an angle, and really going in at a 45-degree angle is really valuable. To be sure that your loaf is cooked, like it looks cooked, but sometimes the oven might be a little bit too high, you might not have paid that much attention to it, and it might be a bit darker on the top than you actually want it to be. Or than it should be for that stage. So I just have, again, another cheap thermometer from a $2 shop. You can actually stick this into the bottom of it. Excuse me while I don't stab myself. Stick it into the bottom of your loaf. Only go like halfway in on an angle. When your loaf is 91 degrees or above, it's baked. And this has just gone up to 97.5. So this is ready. If it's under 91 degrees Celsius, then just pop it back in the oven for a few minutes. Okay, all right, so that was really something that I wanted to show you, because like, it feels like sacrilege sticking a thermometer in the bottom of the loaf, but it actually works really well. It doesn't change it, the structure of it. What you really shouldn't do, if you can avoid it though, is slice your loaf before it's cool. I know it's incredibly tempting, but what I've found from experience is that if you slice it while it's still hot, it tends to squash it and sort of drag the fibres together, and you get this line of dense dough down the bottom. It really changes the whole structure of the loaf, because it continues to cook once you take it out of the oven. And what you'll notice is you put them onto, if you can see here, have them onto just a baking rack, and let them cool completely. And what you will notice is that they will go soft while they're cooling down. So they come out of the oven, they're really crisp. I don't know if you can, wait, so you can hear how crisp it is. They sing as they're cooling, so you hear the crust crackling. That's called singing. And then they'll go soft, but leave them on their rack, let them cool completely, and then they firm up again. Because what happens is the steam inside the dough continues to cook it, and so that steam, as it's sort of dissipating, makes the crust soft, and then when it has dissipated, it firms up again. So you get that lovely crackle while you're doing it. While you're slicing it, I should say. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is go back to looking at our dough again. This has been maybe not quite 10 minutes. Where's my timer? No, apparently I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but we're going to look at it anyway, because we're getting close to running out of time, so I want to show you. All right, thank you. I'm going to tilt you down again. All right, hopefully this is visible. So again, you can see it's starting to relax, the dough's spreading. I'm going to wet my hand again in my twisty ball and reach in underneath it. Now, when you're doing this and you're trying to, again, build as much structure into the loaf, pulling it and stretching it over itself really helps add to that structure. So it develops the gluten strands. It's something like the proteins. It's like glutenin and gliadin, and they when flour is dry, they're all sort of jumbled together, but when it's wet, these strands align themselves, and that's what gives the bread its what gives the dough its stretch, what gives the bread its structure. So that's what you want to develop. And so all we're going to do is just, same thing, reach around the container. Some people say go around once. I tend to go around twice every time I do it. It still only takes about 2 minutes. I've been known to make a batch of dough in the morning that I want to cook that evening, and you can hurry it if you need to. It is a slower process generally. I've been known to mix my dough in the morning and then drive to work while it's autolyzing, and then over the next hour, every 10 minutes, do this. Wash my hands first, very carefully, of course. Mix it up and then put it into a bag and bring it home, because the bulk rise takes many hours, and so it's like having a little kid with you or a Tamagotchi. You tend to it for a little bit, and then it will look after itself, and then when you come home you can actually shape it and bake it for dinner. Sorry, I have a question.
Margaret's asked if you pull the dough like this if you're making scones.
Sourdough scones?
Yeah.
Okay, no, sourdough scones are a different kettle of fish altogether. They are just mixed like regular scones, where you mix the dough, give it a light knead so that it is smooth and elastic, but don't overhandle it, and then you only do that once. So the sourdough scones are actually a super quick one, because once you've done that initial mix and knead, you only have to sit it aside for 20 minutes or 30 minutes to actually rise. So you mix it, knead it, it's a lovely soft pliable dough. Then you cut your scones out, put them in a tray and let them rise for half an hour, and then straight in the oven. So you can have the dough ready within, you can have the finished scones ready within like 40 minutes if you're quick, which is why they're a really good alternative if you don't have any bread ready but you've got soup or something, because they are quite savoury, but they're also terrific with jam and stuff, and they freeze really well. So scones are, they're a creature all of their own, that if you handle the dough too much, they become like lead bullets, but you've got to handle it just enough. So it's just really just practice. So just the way you would mix a regular scone is the way I would do those as well. All right, so let me consult my notes and see what we have to talk about next. Okay. Okay, so with your starters, now I'm hoping that after this you'll all go and make your own loaves of bread. If you fed your starters last night, and I know Heidi was sending out a message suggesting that people do if they wanted to bake today. If you have done that and they're lovely and active and bubbling, then when you go to make your dough today, timing wise, I would, if you're making dough this afternoon, say 2 o'clock, I would be leaving it until 2 o'clock tomorrow, once you've made your dough, to let it do its bulk rise. Then shaping an hour after you've shaped your dough, turning your oven on, letting it preheat for an hour, and 2 hours to 3 hours of rising in the basket if you've left it go for 24 hours in the bulk rise is adequate. You can also let it go longer if you want to, so you could shape it tomorrow, and you could have it proving until you went to bed, put it in the fridge overnight, and get up and preheat your oven and bake it Sunday morning. Sunday morning. Yeah. So you can, that would be Monday morning, I just realised. You can really suit yourself with how you do it timing-wise. There are a number of tutorials. There's one particular baker whose name escapes me, and if I find his details, I'll pop a message up with it. He gives you 3 different scenarios if you want to bake within 24 hours, within 48 hours, or within 72 hours, how much time to allow at each stage, and how to handle your dough. So I'll pop a link up to that, because I found it really useful. And like anything, your sourdough starter becomes your well, it becomes a creature you know, and you know how it's going to behave. You will also work out how your dough is going to behave, and the more you do of it, the easier it becomes. When you're thinking your dough is ready to go into the oven, you've done this, you've done the bulk rise and you've shaped it. I hope this is possible to see. Right, so this dough isn't ready to go in the oven, and when I poke it, so I want to make sure I poke it where there's a bit of flour so it doesn't stick. But when I poke it, it bounces back, but it's a little bit like it bounces back fully, so it's still resisting. When it's ready to bake and you poke it like that, it bounces back, but not all the way. It's like it's almost expended that rise that it's got. It will still have rise in the oven, but yes, so you don't want it to leave a massive dent, because if it leaves a massive dent, that means it's overproofed. You don't want, if it bounces straight back like that one has, it's underproofed, it's not ready to go yet, so you want a little bit of an indentation, but still some spring. Okay, so
sorry,
I have a question.
I just had a question about sort of definitions. They said, is bake rising the same as proving? I think maybe they meant bulk rising.
Oh, bulk rising is what I was saying. I'm sorry if that's not clear. The bulk rise is the initial rise when it's at this stage. So this is the kneading phase, but the next 23 hours out of the 24 that it takes to make that dough is what's called the bulk rise. So I think it's bulk because all the dough is together. Then you shape it and you have the final prove, which is the secondary rise. So I apologise if I wasn't clear about that. But again, please get the notes because there's a lot of detail in there. Okay, how are we going for time? Oh, only 4 minutes to go. Okay, so I'm going to do this dough one more time to show you. We talked about not ever omitting salt. I want to reiterate that again because bread without salt is just awful. Please don't do it. You will just throw it away afterwards. There are various loaves that you can, various ways you can modify. Like if you don't want as much salt, you can definitely do that. But you definitely need some. Okay, I'll show you this, and then I just want to talk quickly about a couple of other versions of sourdough that you can make which don't take quite as long, don't use the starter, but are really interesting. So just bear with me a second, I'm going to tilt the camera down. All right, so here's our dough again. Again, I'm rushing this. I would say leave at least 10 minutes between, between doing these kneadings. Do it over an hour, so you do your initial mixing, and then you leave it anywhere between 10 minutes and an hour. Then over the next hour, you every 10 minutes do this process where you're lifting and stretching. And I hope you can see that that is already becoming a much more glossy and pliant dough. It's much less likely to break now than it was when we started, and certainly nothing like the horrible gloppy mess that it was right at the start. Now, at this point, I would pull all of these bits of dough just to make the container a bit tidier. To the people who did the sourdough starter class a couple of weeks ago, I was explaining that I hate having the sides of the sourdough starter jar messy, so I periodically take them out and clean my jars and then put the starters back into nice clean jars, and I tend to do the same with these containers if it's staying. I think it's easier to manage if there's not lots of extra dough on the side. So for expedience, we won't worry about that now, but I would generally go around and clean it up completely. Okay, so I hope that that's really obviously much more stretchy. It's still breaking, so still won't pass the window pane test, but you would not expect it to at this stage. But look how much it's holding together. It's really starting to resemble dough now. So, okay, I'm going to put that to one side. So I would do that another 3 or 4 times. Pardon me. When I was sure that it was, well enough stretched, and the process of the bulk rise also develops the gluten further. Thank you. So it may not pass the window pane test when you finish it at this point when you finish your hour of kneading. But by the time it has done its bulk rise, it should then be passing its window pane test, because the gluten continues to develop, all the strands continue to align, it becomes much more stretchy and together. So it does all the work for you. So that one I will finish later. And let's pop it to one side. So I wanted to talk to you very briefly about quick sourdough, sort of cheap sourdough. Yeah. Pardon me. There are things where you can make a pre-ferment. So again, this is like the sourdough starter, and this is just for information. It's really a different class of bread. So this is a purely fermented dough, but there are other doughs you can make that combine, like the pizza dough that I showed you before, combine starter and commercial yeast, and you allow a section of the dough to ferment overnight, and then add that into the rest of your mixture the next day to make a quicker sort of version of a sourdough. And they're variously called a Polish, a Bega, a levain, and some sourdoughs. You'll come across this term even making sourdough, that some bakers use what is called a hard sourdough starter. I make a 100% starter, and when I say 100%, equivalent flour and water, because everything in baking is done as, or in bread baking is a baker's percentage. So you have whatever amount of flour, if you have an equivalent amount of water, that's 100%. If you have 80% of the weight of the flour in water, that's an 80% hydration. And this information becomes very useful while you're actually making your doughs. So I make a 100% hydration starter, and some people make a hard starter, which is maybe 50% hydration, and then the night before they want to bake, they take a portion of that hard starter and feed it to get their active starter, which is known as a levain, which then goes on to make their dough the next day. So you'll come across these terms as you're doing it, and hopefully that will just explain what it is when you see it. So it's just a different sort of starter, and what you're using is a wet 100% hydration starter if you're using the one that we made 2 weeks ago. Okay, so how are we going for time? Well, it's 11:01, so if it's all right, I will start taking some more questions if anybody has any. And I apologise, I still can't see myself, so I hope it's been clear. Okay.
So what were you saying about the semi-fermented?
Okay, so there's, as I said, there's a dough called there's a type of dough called a pre-ferment, where you will take 175 grams, as an example, one that I make, 175 grams of flour, 175 grams of water, and about 4 grams of yeast. And I will mix those together very quickly, leave them on the bench overnight. When I come out in the morning, they will be very full. I usually use this container, and it will fill this container. And then that ferments overnight and rises, and that gets added to your yeasted, like if you're making a yeasted loaf, that gets added into your yeasted loaf. Now that, again, because you can substitute sourdough in for commercial yeast, you can use those two processes together. You have some that you pre-ferment overnight, essentially a starter but a higher volume, and then you can add it to your sourdough, the rest of your dough that you make the next day. There's a lot of information out there about it. It's possibly distracting. I apologise. I just find it really interesting that there's yeasted bread, there's sourdough bread which is 100% wild yeast, and then there's this one that sort of sits in the middle where it's uses commercial yeast, but it also is a fermented dough, so it uses what's in the air as well as time to ferment the yeast, but it has that kick along by using commercial yeast.
Doesn't look like there are any questions at this stage.
All right, guys. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I hope it's been clear. Please download the notes. If you have any queries about what's in the notes, my email address is on there. You can leave a question on here. Actually, I do want to address, there was a question left by one of our viewers from the last session. Sorry, Ison, about why you use a single flour to feed your starter. And I did a bit of research. I apologise for not replying sooner because I've been researching it. I had just read that it was advisable to only use the one sort of flour, and so like everywhere I came across, I didn't sort of really question the chemistry behind it. From what I understand, if you use a mix of flour when you make your starter, so you might use a mix of wholemeal and white, or wholemeal and spelt, or a mix. If you maintain that mix as you go through, your starter knows how to behave. It knows how much it's going to be fed, and it reacts accordingly, and you will get a certain amount of activity based on the chemical processes that are going on in the starter. My understanding is that if you start with, say, white flour, and your starter is like the chemical activity is based on the composition of the white flour, that requires a certain amount of feeding, so it requires a certain amount of energy to behave the way you want to predict it's going to behave. If you change the flour at that point, my understanding is that basically the microorganisms in the starter get confused, and so you don't get a predictable degree of activity. So using a mix and continuing that mix is fine, and the microbes in the starter know how to behave, but changing the flour as you go through, which is what I was recommending against, upsets the chemical processes and can slow the development of the starter down. So that's my understanding of it, and I apologise for not answering that question sooner.
So if you start with half spelt, half white, and continue with half spelt, half white.
Yeah, so if you start with a mix, 50-50 of two different sorts of flour, and you continue with that mix of those flours, you'll be fine. When we actually did the sourdough starter class as well, we talked about making a gluten-free sourdough starter, and I've been experimenting in the last 2 weeks, and I just want to show you. I haven't actually made any bread with it yet. I fed this last night, and you can see this is where it was up to, but I hope you can also see that there are lots and lots of bubbles in it. This is made with just a gluten-free flour mix from, actually I think it's the plain gluten-free flour mix from Aldi, which I've just continued, and it's and water. It's slightly higher than 100%, so I use about 120% water to flour, because the gluten-free flour absorbs so much more water that it's very, very thick, and it sort of became crumbly rather than liquid. And now I'll try to show you. I'll just want to give it a little bit of a mix, because what it's done now is it's quite liquid. It's all together. It's like the chemical processes have developed enough that this has now turned into a liquid, cohesive sort of organism, whereas before it was crumbly and dry, and I wouldn't have used it for, been able to use it really for bread. It's really interesting. It smells, I'm sorry I can't actually hand it to you to have you smell it, but it smells quite vinegary, quite sort of alcoholic, but very pleasant. So that's my job for this weekend, is to actually make some bread out of this and see how it works. We've been making gluten-free bread just with actually, to backtrack a second, first of all, could you grab me one of those loaves, please? I'll show you what these loaves look like. There is another sort of dough that you can do. Thank you, from one of my favourite books, which is called, which is called Artisan Bread in 5 Minutes a Day. It's actually a yeasted bread, but you make a batch of dough and it can stay in the fridge for up to 14 days. And even though it has a commercial yeast, it ferments over time. So, pardon me.
Maybe have another go showing the starter as well.
Oh, sure. Okay, so here's, I don't know if you can see the starter. Again, I really apologise that I can't see what's going on. but you can see it's really cohesive. It's sort of quite liquid. If you look at the side, you can see that there's a fair bit of movement in it. So, like I said, about 120% of water to the gluten-free flour to give it that sort of pliability. But so you can also make gluten-free bread in this way with using the dough that you pre-mix, and that is, so here's the gluten-free bread. So Artisan Loaf made at the start of the week, and this dough was made, I think it was Wednesday, and then I left it in the fridge and I baked these loaves last night, and you can literally just pull off a section of the dough and bake it from scratch. You can do the same with regular wheat floured bread. There's a link to the book, or there's a reference to the book in the notes, so that might be useful if anybody's interested. That's, again, not a sourdough loaf, but it is a fermented loaf. I'll grab the book and just show you, because it's a really distinctive cover. Okay, so this is the book. Well worth a look, just in terms of speedy bread methodology. The way they do it is really clever. They do over salt their loaves, so be sparse with the salt. They tend to have a third again as much salt as I would normally put in. I always reduce their salt, but their recipes are very good, and again, not a true sourdough, but a fermented loaf, which is really useful if you don't have a starter that's active, or you need to whip something up quickly. That can be ready, actually baked, because you can use the dough straight away as well. It doesn't have to ferment, so you could have a loaf on the table within a couple of hours, or you can have the dough in the fridge and you can have fresh bread in the morning, much the same way you can with the sourdough. So, okay, so do we have any more questions? No questions? Okay, so thank you very much. I hope it was useful and interesting. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'll come back to this during the week and pick up any questions, and if I don't know straight away, I will research and I will get back to you. But I really appreciate that you've come in today, and hope to talk to you about bread again. Okay, thanks very much. Bye.